As long as I've watched football, the Portuguese Cup has always been dominated by the big three. Sure, they haven't won it every single time, but you bet your ass they at least made it to the final. In fact, I had never seen a single Portuguese Cup final without at least one of the giants involved. But you know me, I'm not here to waste your time talking about some random cup edition. Nah, the 1998-99 Portuguese Cup was anything but ordinary. And today, I'm here to tell you all about it. In this video, you're taking a trip back in time to a season where the Giants were systematically humiliated, the spotlight shifted to the underdogs, and the final looked like something straight out of a cheesy teen sports movie. But first, as usual, let me give you some context. In 1998, the Portuguese football landscape looked pretty different from what we see today. Porto were on their last season of the iconic Penta after dominating their rivals for years. They had one of the world's best strikers in Jardel and a squad packed with names still remembered to this day, like Bahia, Luizio, Jorge Costa. Sporting had been falling short of expectations for a while. They hadn't won the league since 1982, even though the 90s saw them produce plenty of national talent. Guys like Paulo Sousa, Sabinho, Jorge Cadet, and of course, Luís Figo. Benfica? Well, they were at their all-time low. Or at least getting there, depending on how you see it. They'd been the last team to win the league before Porto's 5-year reign, but Manuel Damasio's disastrous management followed by Vale Azevedo's circus pushed them into a hole they'd struggled to crawl out of. On the other hand, the B-plus teams back then were much stronger than what you see today. Boavista were basically the Braga of their era, maybe not as consistent, maybe a little bit more chaotic, but always on the verge of something historic. Vitória Guimarães were strong and consistent too, and teams like Marítimo, Braga and Salgueiros were growing and promised to shake things up. I think I've been fair here. Gave the proper spotlight to the best footballing teams in Portugal during the 90s, but that's a funny part of today's story. The 1998-99 Portuguese Cup went completely against logic. What had been happening in Portuguese football over the past decade had absolutely no impact on this edition. So today, we're gonna focus on the clubs you would never dream of seeing in this channel. Starting with Esposende. Now, I don't know much about Esposende. I've never been there, even though it's not that far from where I live. I figured that they had a club. I mean, every town in Portugal does, but I never imagined they'd once had a run this legendary. Here's the thing, Associação Desportiva de Esposende isn't some fallen historic club. They're actually pretty new. They were founded in 1978 and they only reached the second division for the first time in 1998. They stayed for just 2 seasons. They had no stars. They launched Petit, sure, but it's not like they had a super promising squad or big name players. But again, this story isn't supposed to make sense. What matters is that quietly, Esposende carved out a historic run that started in round 4 against Lourdes. They beat that modest club right at the death. I don't know if it was a close game or if they dominated and just struggled to score. It was such an obscure match that I couldn't find any info about it. The fact is, they made it through to round 5. Unlike Sporting. Yeah, Sporting, with Simão Sabrosa and a young Gabriel Heinz in the starting 11. Seriously, did you know Heinz played for Sporting? Because I didn't. Anyway, they lost to Gil Vicente that Sunday, which was already a shock in itself. But round 5, that's when this tournament truly went off the rails. While Esposende eliminated Naval Primeiro de Maio with a goal from Petit, Benfica featuring Poborski, Nuno Gomes, and a bunch of British dudes I've never heard of, got knocked out by Vitória de Setúbal. So surely this cup was Porto's to lose, right? That's what any Porto fan must have thought, especially before facing two Leões from the 3rd tier at the Antas, but the only thing they took from that game was the most humiliating fall of the whole season. In the 87th minute, Claudio Eiras scored the goal of his life and eliminated Porto, on Carnival Day no less. Probably the most important day of the year in Torres Vedras. So there we were, adding to the round of 16 with these names. Maia, Feirense, Gil Vicente, Boa Vista, Esposende, Caçadores das Taipas, Videm, Marítimo, Campo Mairense, Alverca, Passos de Ferreira, Vitória de Setúbal, Beira-Mar and União de Leiria. The big 3 were out, and for the first time ever, they'd all been knocked out this early. Still, Boa Vista looked like the obvious favorites, but this cup wasn't made for favorites. Boa Vista barely scraped past Gil Vicente and then came up against the mighty Esposende, who in their home ground made history. The whole country now knew the club, the city, thanks to a feat no one saw coming. One goal was enough to book their spot in the semis. And they were the only team to qualify that round, because the other 3 matches ended in extra time and, according to the rules back then, that meant they had to be replayed. No penalties, those only came in the replay if needed. Honestly, it was a waste of time. Anyway, 4 teams reached the semis and they all deserved it. Vitória Setúbal, who were probably the favorites at this point, were a traditional cup side with 2 wins and 9 final appearances. Then you had Beira-Mar, who had advanced the last 2 rounds through replays, Campo Maiorense, who had knocked out Braga and Marítimo, and last but not least, the improbable Esposende. No matter what happened next, these 4 clubs had a break from their rough seasons and a chance to be the stars for once. That said, things weren't going great. Setúbal had just been hammered 6-0 by Porto. Beira-Mar were in the relegation zone. Campo Maiorense were barely keeping their heads above water, and Esposende were just trying to survive in the second tier. Honestly, it could go any direction, and in the historic Bonfim Stadium, it was Ricardo Sousa who gave Beira-Mar the lead in the first half. Minutes later, Vitória went down to 10 men and Beira-Mar left Setúbal with their ticket to the final. Meanwhile, in the tiny Estádio Padre Sá Pereira, Campo Maiorense, fresh off a draw against Benfica, proved too much for Esposende and ended their historic campaign. And isn't that weird? In any other year, Campo Maiorense reaching the final would be a massive shock. But this season, it was expected. And in a way, it marked the end of the true fairy tale of this competition. On the day of the final, the morale between the 2 clubs couldn't have been more different. The Greyhounds from Campo Maior were buzzing. Favorites even, after securing survival in the league just a few days earlier. Beira-Mar on the other hand were already relegated. It was a hot summer afternoon and tempers were flaring from the start. 4 yellow cards in the first half alone. Campo Maiorense looked sharper, like they really wanted to make history. In the second half, the cards kept coming, but now in a different color. Half an hour from the end, Beira-Mar went down to 10 men. But it didn't faze them, not one bit. Around 10 minutes later, Ricardo Sousa struck again. He scored for Beira-Mar, sending his teammates and his coach into pure ecstasy. And the coach, his father, António Sousa, a Porto legend. On that day, he led Beira-Mar from the bench while his son led them on the pitch. But the match wasn't over. If the scoreboard offered hope, the mood on the field was only getting worse. Moments after the goal, the ref reached for his pocket again. Twice. 2 more red cards, 1 for each team, 3 reds in the final, maximum tension, heavy pitch, nerves everywhere, except Beira-Mar. They looked like they were pulled forward by fate, and against all odds, down to 9 men, relegated, written off, Beira-Mar won. Yes, Beira-Mar won the Portuguese Cup. A story that sounds like a cheap football movie script, but it really happened. A doomed club lifting the trophy, with father and son sharing the greatest moment in their history. And maybe that's what makes Portuguese football so special. Even when all hope seems lost, there's always room for one last twist. But then again, not all twists are made to last. We fast forward 26 years and the scene feels like a sad tale of unfulfilled promises. Beira-Mar, the unlikely hero of that summer afternoon, now drifts in the 4th tier of Portuguese football. The iconic father-son duo never had a proper sequel. António Sousa hasn't coached since 2012, and Ricardo, despite a solid season later on at Boa Vista, never reached the level so many predicted for him. Today, there's a new Sousa making waves. Afonso Sousa, grandson and son, who's been impressing in Poland and might still write a new chapter for this footballing lineage. Campo Maiorense collapsed 2 years later and never recovered. In fact, it hasn't even had a senior team in over a decade. Vitória Setúbal, a sleeping giant, is going through its darkest days in the regional leagues. And Esposende, who once dreamed of the top, also returned to the reality of local football. Portuguese football is rich in epic moments, but also in fast forgettings, and that's why it's worth telling these stories, so they don't get lost in time. So we remember that for brief moments, even the most unlikely touch the sky. That's exactly why you should subscribe to Throne FC. I'm always dropping videos about the past, present and future of Portuguese football that you won't find anywhere else. Like this one, where I take you back to one of the best summers of your life, 2016. We were on top of the world. Eder, Fernando Santos, Ronaldo limping, and a big ass French melon, bringing back memories? Then click on the video. I'll see you there.